Former President Donald Trump thought he had seen and heard it all. The man who built his career on spectacle, insults, and dominance walked into that congressional hearing, certain he would leave with the spotlight firmly on him. And at first, it seemed like he would. He cracked a joke at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's expense. The chamber laughed, some nervously, some a little too eagerly. Cameras zoomed in. Trump smirked, convinced he had embarrassed her. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice, didn't rush to respond. She simply waited. 17 seconds later, she began to speak. And what followed left the former president silent. With law, history, and unshakable presence, she burned him with facts in real time. Before we dive into the moment that flipped the hearing upside down and stunned the political world, hit that like button and subscribe, because this is what happens when spectacle meets substance. The air inside the hearing room was thick with cameras, whispers, and anticipation. Former President Donald J. Trump had just leaned back in his chair, lips curled into that practiced half-smirk that once drew applause from his rallies. He thought he had landed the punchline. He thought he had humiliated his opponent, but silence followed. Not the approving silence of a crowd waiting for more, but the uneasy silence of a nation holding its breath. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't reach for the microphone in haste or rush to defend herself. She simply sat there, eyes steady, posture straight, hands folded over the stack of papers in front of her. Her calmness was louder than his insult. Cameras zoomed in, cutting between Trump's smirk beginning to twitch and Jasmine's unshaken composure. Millions watching at home saw the contrast. One man desperate to provoke, one woman refusing to bend. The committee room seemed suspended in time. Reporters stopped typing. Lawmakers shifted uneasily in their seats. The audience gallery leaned forward, waiting for what would follow. Trump coughed into the microphone as if to remind everyone he was still in control. Yet the control was already gone. He didn't know it yet, but the insult he had thrown into the air was about to boomerang back with precision. In that moment, the only sound was the low hum of the cameras capturing every flicker of his face. And then the question lingered in the minds of everyone watching. What just happened? Because in less than half a minute, the balance of power in this room was going to shift. And when it did, Donald Trump would find himself burned by the very facts he thought no one would dare speak aloud. The congressional hearing was billed as routine oversight, but everyone in the room knew it was anything but routine. The banner headline that morning had already framed it as a spectacle. Trump faces questions on democracy. Crockett in the chair. Networks cleared their schedules. Online outlets prepared their clips in advance, and millions of Americans tuned in, not to learn about procedure, but to witness confrontation. The subject on paper was the integrity of elections and the state of American democracy. Beneath that paper-thin description lay a battlefield of history, power, and identity. Questions of voter suppression, misinformation, and accountability had hung over the nation like storm clouds. To some, this was a chance to expose systemic failures and demand reform. To others, it was an opportunity to rewrite the narrative, to frame oversight as harassment and accountability as political theater. Jasmine Crockett entered this arena with purpose. A first-term Congresswoman, a lawyer by training, and a woman whose sharp tongue had already become the subject of both admiration and attack. She embodied the tension of the moment. Her position was clear. Democracy survived only when the rule of law was protected. When every voice, regardless of race, wealth, or geography, was given its rightful place in the ballot box. To her, defending voting rights wasn't abstract policy. It was lived experience. Trump, on the other hand, was not officially on trial. He was a guest, a witness of sorts, invited to speak under oath about the claims and conduct surrounding the 2020 election and its aftermath. Yet he arrived not as a participant in dialogue, but as a combatant prepared for a duel. His demeanor was familiar, shoulders back, chin raised, voice pitched to carry over cameras rather than colleagues. He thrived on performance. He had long believed that intimidation, repetition, and ridicule were more powerful than facts. His motive was clear: undermine Jasmine before she could challenge him, frame the hearing as a witch hunt, and project dominance to his base. It wasn't simply about today's headlines. It was about shaping the story for tomorrow's campaign rallies, where clips would be played not as oversight, but as proof of persecution. Those who knew Trump's style recognized the rhythm already forming. He would open with charm, coat it in sarcasm, escalate to insult, and finally attempt to drown out opposition with volume. He counted on rattling his adversaries, forcing them into defensive posture. That was how he won before. Not with substance, but with spectacle. But Jasmine Crockett was not built for spectacle. She was built for patience. Unlike many who tried to shout over Trump and lost themselves in the noise, she approached him like a litigator approaches a hostile witness. Let them talk. Let them reveal. Let them unravel. Her calmness was her weapon, and her weapon was razor sharp. The stakes could not have been higher. This was not a private courtroom. It was a televised clash with global eyes watching. Every gesture, every pause, every line carried weight far beyond the hearing room. Supporters and critics alike sat glued to screens, waiting for the viral moment that would travel faster than any policy briefing ever could. Trump's allies in the chamber looked eager, whispering among themselves, prepared to clap or jeer at his cues. Jasmine's colleagues sat still, knowing she needed no coaching, knowing her restraint would sting more than any interruption. At its core, the battle line was this: one man who believed in power through humiliation versus one woman who believed in power through presence. And as the hearing began to unfold, the room itself seemed to brace for impact. For millions watching at home, it felt less like oversight and more like a prize fight. Only the weapons weren't fists. They were words, records, and memory. And in that space between insult and response, the entire future of this hearing balanced like a scale waiting to tip. Donald Trump leaned forward toward the microphone, his voice soft at first, almost syrupy, the kind of tone meant to suggest generosity, but laced with venom beneath. "You know," he began, pausing just long enough for cameras to catch his practiced smirk, "I actually admire Congresswoman Crockett's energy. Really, I do. She's very passionate. Passion is good. You need passion when you don't have much else." A ripple moved through the room, half chuckle, half discomfort. Report's pen scratched across notepads. The backhanded compliment landed with its intended sting. Trump adjusted his tie, leaned back as though he had delivered something clever. "But let's be honest here," he continued, raising his voice slightly. "Passion doesn't mean wisdom. Passion doesn't mean experience. And passion doesn't mean you understand how the world really works. I've built skyscrapers. I've run a country. What has she done? Some little cases down in Texas. It's cute. It really is." The chuckles grew sharper, echoing from his allies, seated along the dais. Jasmine didn't move. Her pen rested against her papers, eyes focused, posture unbending. Trump smelled blood. He pressed forward. "You know, I hear a lot of talk from her about democracy and fairness. Sounds nice. Sounds like a speech you'd give at a college rally. But this is real life. Real life doesn't care about theories. Real life doesn't care about feelings. Real life is tough. And if you're not tough enough, you get embarrassed. That's what's happening right now. Believe me." The words hung in the air, louder than they needed to be. He let them linger, his gaze sweeping the audience, daring them to agree. Nervous laughter bubbled from the gallery, half amusement, half discomfort at the audacity of it all. He leaned closer again, his tone now edging toward mockery. "She talks about protecting democracy, but where was she when our elections were rigged? Where was she when Americans lost faith in their system? Probably writing another angry tweet. Probably filing another lawsuit that nobody read. She wants to act like she's some kind of hero. Please. We all know heroes don't sit on committees throwing around words they don't understand." The allies behind him smirked, one even nodding. The rest of the room shifted uneasily. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others glanced at Jasmine, curious, waiting for a reaction. But she gave them nothing. Trump wasn't finished. His voice hardened. The soft edges of false praise now sharpened into open ridicule. And let's be clear about one thing. She doesn't love this country the way I do. She doesn't fight for it the way I fought. If she did, she'd be proud of it, not constantly tearing it down. She'd celebrate America's greatness instead of acting like it's broken. But that's what she does. She undermines. She attacks. And frankly, it's embarrassing. There it was. The direct jab. The insult no longer hidden beneath layers of sarcasm, but laid bare. He had questioned her intelligence, her achievements, her patriotism. It was the trifecta of his arsenal. Diminish, dismiss, and discredit. The room shifted again. Side glances flickered between lawmakers. Some pressed their lips together, uncomfortable with the spectacle. Others leaned in, eager to see how far he would go. Trump gave them more. You can't fix America with lectures, Jasmine. You can't fix America with tweets and speeches. You need guts. You need power. You need people who've been there, done it, won. That's what I've done. And you? He paused deliberately, letting his eyes lock on hers. You wouldn't even make it past the lobby of one of my towers. Laughter, uneasy and loud this time, broke across the chamber. His allies grinned. The sound echoed like an applause line at a rally. He folded his hands, satisfied, believing he had seized control of the moment. Jasmine Crockett did not move. She didn't reach for the mic. She didn't offer a retort. She simply held his gaze still as a stone. The silence she carried unsettled more than his insults ever could. The audience, still buzzing from the laughter, began to sense it, the tension coiling back toward him. The longer she sat quiet, the sharper the anticipation grew. She hadn't said a word yet, and that silence was already louder than his attack. For a long moment, Jasmine Crockett did nothing. She let the echoes of laughter wash through the chamber. Let them bounce off marble walls. Let them dissolve into an uneasy hush. Trump shifted in his chair, still smirking, but the confidence began to feel forced. He had expected interruption, outrage, a firestorm of words to clash against his own. Instead, he got silence. Jasmine's hands moved slowly, deliberately. She adjusted the neat stack of papers before her, flipping a page without looking down, as though the attack had been background noise unworthy of her attention. Her pen clicked softly, the only sound punctuating the heavy air. The cameras caught it all. The poise, the patience, the refusal to engage on his terms. Even the audience began to sense it. Silence wasn't weakness. It was preparation. She lifted her eyes, meeting his across the table. No raised brows, no scowl, just a level gaze that suggested she was studying, cataloging, preparing her move. When she finally leaned toward the microphone, her voice was calm, almost gentle. "Are you done?" The words landed heavier than any outburst could have. No sarcasm, no dramatic pause, just a clean incision, surgical in tone. A few lawmakers blinked, caught off guard. Some in the gallery chuckled nervously, unsure whether it was a statement or a question. Trump shifted, leaning back, his smirk flickering for the first time. Jasmine didn't wait for him to answer. She turned a page, her finger tracing a highlighted line. "I just want to be clear," she said, voice steady. "You've accused me of lacking wisdom, experience, patriotism, and integrity. Did I catch all of that?" Trump opened his mouth, but she held up a hand. Not abrupt, not dismissive, but with the control of someone steering the pace of a deposition. "Good. Then, let's go through them one at a time." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pound the desk. Instead, she began with precision, each word like the careful slide of a scalpel. "On wisdom, I studied the law, practiced it, and defended clients whose rights were threatened when no one else would. On experience, I've tried cases, drafted legislation, and argued in courts where results aren't measured in applause lines, but in justice served." She flipped another page, her movements methodical, as though his attack had merely set the agenda for her prepared notes. "On patriotism, I swore an oath to this country, not to myself. I swore it to protect the Constitution, not my brand. I swore it knowing service isn't measured by towers you build, but by lives you protect, and on integrity. She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. I came here to answer questions, not to avoid them. Every phrase was deliberate, her cadence slowing the room. She was not defending herself so much as placing facts on the record. The contrast was stark. His mockery versus her method. His showmanship versus her substance. Trump tapped his finger against the table, restless. His allies glanced away, suddenly less eager to grin. The gallery leaned forward, sensing the shift. Jasmine didn't stop. She folded her hands again, calm as before. So before we continue, let me ask you this. Which part of your statement should I take seriously? The compliment, the insult, or the part where you confuse volume with truth? The silence that followed wasn't hers this time. It belonged to him. Jasmine Crockett let her last question hang in the air. Which part of your statement should I take seriously? And then, without raising her voice, began the kind of methodical dismantling that could only come from years in a courtroom. She straightened her notes, though she hardly needed them. Every word seemed memorized, carved into her. Let's start with this idea of wisdom, she said, tone even, as if speaking to a jury. You claim wisdom comes from building towers and making deals, but I'd remind you, 4 of those towers ended in bankruptcy. 4,000 of working people lost jobs, pensions, and homes, while you walked away with loopholes and lawyers. If that is wisdom, then it is the wisdom of exploitation, not leadership. The room stirred. Pen scribbled furiously. Trump's lips pressed tight. She continued, never once raising her volume. You see, wisdom isn't the ability to protect yourself while everyone else pays the cost. Wisdom is making sure the cost is fairly shared. It's fighting for families who can't afford a lobbyist, for veterans who can't afford a lawyer, for voters who can't afford to lose their voice. That's the wisdom I've practiced, not in boardrooms, but in courtrooms. A pause. She glanced at him, eyes sharp but calm. An experience. You suggested my cases were small, that my work was cute. Allow me to remind you that the Voting Rights Act doesn't call cases small. The Constitution doesn't call equal protection small. The Supreme Court doesn't call access to the ballot box cute. Every single time I walked into a courtroom to defend a voter purged from the rolls. Every time I stood with a client silenced by discriminatory law, I carried not one person's fate, but the promise of democracy itself. Tell me which part of that sounds small to you? The smirk was gone now. Trump shifted in his chair, tugging at his cufflinks. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice steady. And patriotism, perhaps the most dangerous accusation you leveled. You said I don't love this country because I dare to challenge it. Let me be clear. Challenging your country is not betrayal. It is fidelity. It is the most patriotic act you can perform. Frederick Douglass reminded us that he would not stand by the flag and see it stained and dishonored. Dr. King reminded us that patriotism sometimes means calling your country to live up to its creed. Patriotism is not wrapping yourself in the flag while you shred the values it stands for. Patriotism is holding your nation accountable precisely because you love it enough not to let it fail. A murmur ran through the room. Even those on the far end of the dais looked unsettled. She turned a page deliberately, the rustle of paper magnified in the silence. Integrity. You questioned mine. You called me embarrassing, yet I showed up here prepared to answer questions under oath. You, sir, have spent years dodging depositions, defying subpoenas, and hiding behind executive privilege. You call it strength. The law calls it obstruction. You call it bold. The courts call it contempt. Her eyes scanned the chamber, then returned to him. So, let's be clear on integrity. Integrity isn't a stage performance. Integrity isn't a brand. Integrity is showing up, telling the truth, and facing consequences. That's what I'm doing right now. That's what you've avoided. Trump's fingers drummed on the table, restless. For once, he had no line ready. Jasmine softened her voice, almost reflective. You told me I wouldn't make it past the lobby of your towers. Maybe that's true. Maybe you would have looked at me, black, female, working-class roots, and thought I didn't belong in marble halls built on borrowed credit. But I'll tell you this, I've stood in courtrooms where my very presence meant survival for people whose names you'll never know. I've stood in classrooms where children asked if their votes mattered. I've stood in communities where people were told their voices were too small, too weak, too disposable. And every single time I made sure they were heard, the gallery was silent now, rapt. The tension was no longer his show. It was her presence. She pressed on, each sentence heavier than the last. You believe power is the ability to embarrass others. I believe power is the ability to endure embarrassment and still stand. You believe winning is never admitting fault. I believe winning is admitting fault and growing stronger. You call accountability an attack. I call it democracy. Trump's face tightened. He leaned back, folding his arms, glaring. But he did not interrupt. Jasmine allowed herself the smallest pause, then delivered the final blow. You called it bold. I call it survival. And we're still here. The words cracked the room open. For a long beat, no one moved. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. Lawmakers' faces turned toward her, then toward him, then back again. The silence was thicker than applause, more cutting than boos. Trump opened his mouth, but nothing came. No insult, no line, no smirk. The cameras captured it. The moment he was rendered speechless, not by volume, but by fact. Jasmine leaned back, folding her hands over her papers once more, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everyone in the room knew something irreversible had. The hearing was no longer his show. It was hers. The silence after Jasmine's final line stretched into something heavier than applause. The words, you call it bold. I call it survival. And we're still here, hung in the air like a verdict. For the first time all morning, Donald Trump was still, his lips pursed, his fingers no longer drummed. His eyes narrowed but vacant. The smirk that had carried him into the hearing evaporated. The lawmakers who had been whispering earlier now sat straighter, their attention fixed. Some scribbled notes more carefully, no longer casual observers, but active witnesses. It was as though the chamber itself had recalibrated. Representative Thompson, a senior member who rarely ceded the spotlight, leaned back with his arms folded, his gaze shifting from Trump to Jasmine with something close to respect. Senator Alvarez, known for her sharp questions, nodded slightly in Jasmine's direction, a subtle but unmistakable acknowledgement. Even those who had been skeptical of her earlier, those who wondered whether she had the gravitas to go toe-to-toe with a former president, now found themselves recalculating. Her logic wasn't just airtight. It was unignorable. The ripple effect was immediate. Trump's closest allies, seated behind him, had laughed loudest when he delivered his jab about lobbies and towers. Now they avoided eye contact altogether. One fiddled with a pen, another shifted papers noisily, as though distraction might shield him from the discomfort. The gallery, which had been divided between chuckles and sighs, now leaned almost uniformly toward Jasmine. Power had shifted in real time. You could feel it in the room, the way oxygen itself seemed to move toward her table. Jasmine didn't bask in it. She didn't smile triumphantly or glance at cameras. Instead, she resumed her posture, calm, composed, professional. That choice made the contrast even sharper. Trump had performed for the cameras. She had performed for the record, and the record now belonged to her. Committee Chairwoman Ellis cleared her throat, visibly rattled before announcing, "The gentlewoman from Texas has concluded her remarks." But even Ellis's voice betrayed a subtle shift. Where earlier she sounded impatient, now there was respect edging her tone. Trump finally leaned forward as if to reclaim ground, but no one was waiting on him anymore. His voice, when he muttered about witch hunts and rigged systems, no longer carried the weight it once did. The reporters didn't sprint to capture those lines. The lawmakers didn't respond with knowing nods. Instead, pens scratched only when Jasmine spoke. Representative Nguyen, sitting 3 seats down, whispered audibly to a colleague, She just changed the whole room. It wasn't flattery. It was observation. The cameras captured more than words. They captured body language, Trump's shoulders sagging, Jasmine's upright composure, allies' avoidance of eye contact, neutral members leaning forward with sharpened focus. The footage itself would become its own evidence of power dynamics shifting in the span of minutes. In the back row, a younger staffer whispered, "That's the clip. That's the one they'll play tonight." And he was right. Everyone sensed it. The moment had already moved beyond the room and into history. Trump's allies tried to recover, chiming in with procedural complaints and muttered interruptions, but their timing was off. Their voices sounded shrill, hollow. The authority they thought they shared had evaporated with his silence. Jasmine sat quietly, letting them scramble. She didn't need to add anything. She had already said enough, and the restraint in her silence magnified her authority. The shift wasn't just visible. It was measurable. You could trace it in the glances exchanged across the dais, in the posture of those who once leaned back, now leaning forward. Respect had been won, not with shouting, but with composure, not with spectacle, but with substance. By the time the gavel tapped to signal the next round of questioning, the atmosphere was transformed. What began as a stage for Trump's dominance had become a platform for Jasmine's authority. And as the cameras panned across the room, one thing was clear. Power, once assumed, had migrated. It belonged to her now. The hearing ended hours later, but the moment itself had already escaped the confines of the chamber. Even before the gavel came down, clips of Jasmine Crockett's clapback were racing across the internet. Journalists in the press pool hadn't even waited to file polished stories. They simply clipped the 37-second exchange and posted it raw. The caption varied depending on the outlet. Trump stunned into silence. Crockett's calm burn. The moment the room shifted, but the video was the same. Trump mocking the chamber laughing, Jasmine waiting, and then in a tone as cool as steel, cutting him down with law, history, and that unforgettable line. You called it bold. I call it survival. And we're still here on X. Hashtags exploded. I Burned by Crockett reached trending status within minutes. Survival, not boldness, wasn't far behind. Users across the political spectrum weighed in, some gleefully, some grudgingly, all acknowledging the undeniable impact. One clip shared by a college student racked up 2 million views within the first hour. Another, posted by a civil rights historian, overlaid Jasmine's words with archival footage of Frederick Douglass and Dr. King, framing her remarks as part of a larger continuum of American struggle. By nightfall, TikTok remixes layered her voice over music tracks, turning the moment into a cultural phenomenon. Conservative media scrambled to find footing. On one network, a panelist insisted she had been disrespectful to a former president. But even as he spoke, the split screen played the viral clip on loop. Another network tried to frame the silence as Trump's strategic choice not to engage. Yet the clip betrayed that spin, his mouth opening, closing, then closing again. Silence not his choice, but his defeat. Meanwhile, mainstream outlets ran with the narrative of reversal. The Washington Post headline read, "Crockett seizes the hearing." The New York Times declared, "Trump meets his match." Cable networks replayed the exchange every half hour, analysts marveling at the control she had displayed. Commentators who once dismissed her as fiery but inexperienced admitted on air she handled it better than anyone expected. One conservative columnist, begrudgingly honest, tweeted, "I don't agree with her politics." But Crockett just showed a masterclass in discipline. Trump looked rattled. At campaign headquarters across the country, strategists took note. They recognized the danger of a moment like this, not just as a one-day news cycle, but as a narrative shift. A young black congresswoman standing her ground against a former president and leaving him speechless was an image too potent to dismiss. But while the media spun and social platforms buzzed, Jasmine Crockett herself remained grounded. When reporters chased her down the Capitol steps, microphones crowding, She smiled politely but didn't add more fuel. "I said what I needed to say," she told them. "The record speaks for itself." She didn't gloat. She didn't claim victory. Instead, she carried herself as though nothing extraordinary had happened, as though she had simply done her job. That choice only amplified the moment. Back in her office, staffers monitored the flood of notifications with wide eyes. One aide exclaimed, "Congresswoman, you're everywhere right now." Another laughed nervously, showing her a meme where her words had been printed over an image of a burning tower. Survival still standing. Jasmine glanced at the screen, chuckled softly, and then returned to reviewing case notes for her next committee assignment. "Clips fade," she reminded her team. "The work doesn't." That steadiness became its own story. While the internet roared, she kept moving forward, focused on substance rather than spectacle. It was exactly that refusal to chase the spotlight that made her stand out in a political climate addicted to performance. By the end of the night, major anchors closed their broadcasts with the same footage. Millions had seen it live. Tens of millions more had seen it online. And each time the clip replayed, the narrative grew stronger. Trump had tried to embarrass Jasmine Crockett. 17 seconds later, she burned him with facts. And facts, once spoken with such clarity, could not be undone. 2 days later, Jasmine Crockett walked into a modest community center on the south side of Dallas. The building was far from the marble halls of Congress. Fluorescent lights hummed. Folding chairs lined the floor. Children's artwork decorated the walls. Yet the energy in the room felt no less significant. Neighbors, teachers, retirees, and students had gathered to hear her speak. Not about the viral clip, not about the headlines, but about the ongoing fight for fairness in their daily lives. When she stepped to the podium, the applause was warm, not thunderous. It was the kind of applause given to someone who belonged, not to a celebrity passing through. She smiled, adjusted the microphone, and began simply, "I came here because your voices matter more than any headline ever will." She spoke about voting access, about the importance of civic duty, about the responsibility to stay engaged even when the system feels heavy. She didn't reference Trump by name. She didn't replay the exchange. Instead, she talked about resilience, the quiet kind, the collective kind, the kind that keeps communities alive. During the Q&A, a young girl, no more than 12, raised her hand. Her voice trembled as she asked, "How did you stay so calm when he was making fun of you?" The room hushed. Jasmine bent slightly at the podium, lowering herself to the girl's height, her tone gentle. "Because shouting isn't the same as strength," she said. "And calm doesn't mean weak. When you know who you are, no one else can tell your story for you." The girl's eyes widened. She whispered into the microphone, "Thank you for standing up without shouting." The audience broke into soft applause, some wiping their eyes. Jasmine placed a hand over her heart. "That's what we all have to remember." She told them, "Power isn't in the noise we make. Power is in the truth we carry, the presence we bring, and the way we hold steady, even when others try to shake us." As she stepped away from the podium, the line followed her out the door, carried by those who had heard it firsthand, and those who would repeat it later. Power isn't volume.